episode of the Mediums Messages and More podcast. I'm Gene King. On this episode, we're going to do some post election day analysis on where the media in general stands after the 2024 election. It was a historic election on the media side. A lot of changes were evident in the media, the types of media, the different media that played roles, those that ascended, those that declined. So we're going to take a look at all of that, look at the winners and losers by networks and channels, and also do some forward looking analysis to get an idea of where we might be headed by the time we get to the next presidential election in 2028, and which media might be the more dominant as compared to what happened uh, this year. So to start, I think a primary headline would be that despite the historic advertising spending that easily surpassed all previous records, the 2024 US presidential election will likely be the last one so dominated by old school legacy media and its big brand names. Television, including all methods of utilization by consumers, and this includes free broadcast over the air channels, cable, satellite, and streaming. In general, any method of using a television use, grabbed the large bulk of the record amount of money spent by political campaigns and affiliated supporting groups this year. And radio and print media also benefited by a much lesser amount of money, but it was television by far that grabbed the majority of the record billions of dollars spent for political advertising for this campaign. But the ascendancy and the growing importance of social media, podcasting, and standalone apps for media outlets that are independent, um, as well as entrepreneurial media types, public personalities that are doing their own commentary um, on mobile devices, including tablets and phones, was clear. Although television was still the absolute dominant player in grabbing the most money for political advertising, and it was still the primary focus on both presidential campaigns this year. There was no doubt that the importance of alternative, and I put alternative in quotes because they're really not going to be alternative much longer. They will most likely be the mainstream, but social media, podcasting clearly rose in the ranks of importance and influence in this election. As with cord cutting, this election proved that consumers are leaving legacy and big brand media, such as the New York Times, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, the Washington Post, etc., in large numbers. The migration of audiences to new outlets and sources, particularly for political content, is unmistakable. And the 2024 election showed this during the months leading up to Election Day and on the day itself. And I'll give you one glaring statistic as just one example. So on election night, Nielsen estimated that about 42.29 million people tuned in to traditional broadcast networks and cable for election night coverage. 42.29 million people. One episode of Joe Rogan's podcast that featured President elect Donald Trump as the guest 2 weeks before Election Day generated 40 million views in 3 days. The 42 million plus audience on election night for TV and cable needed 18 channels to achieve that number of viewers. So think about that. Donald Trump goes on one podcast. Now, it happens to be the most popular, the most listened to podcast at the moment, but still, Trump goes on one podcast 2 weeks before Election Day, and in 3 days, there are 40 million viewers to that podcast, viewers, listeners to that podcast. And it took 18 channels combined on free over the air broadcast and cable to get just over 42 million people. So the scale of the audience migrating to podcasting, the reach that one podcast can provide is absolutely clear now. So President-elect Trump and his campaign, they made a decision to appear on more than a dozen major podcasts this election year. And that included Logan Paul's Impulsive and Theo Vaughn's this past weekend. The estimated total reach of those appearances was at least 80 million viewers by Election Day. Vice President Kamala Harris's campaign also decided to incorporate podcasts into her strategy, but to a lesser frequency than the Trump campaign and on smaller shows. Still, though, the vice president appeared on the second largest podcast on Spotify after Rogan's, the Call Her Daddy with Alex Cooper podcast. And that was 2 weeks before Trump appeared on the Rogan's podcast. But the Harris episode with Cooper just simply failed to generate much interest and had less than 1 million viewers by Election Day. So if we just want to take that comparative stat alone, Trump appeared on one podcast and had 40 million viewers, listeners in 3 days. Vice President Harris appears on a podcast and failed to get a million in a month. So that's a whole other episode. That is a whole other strategy moving forward for campaign strategists and media planners on what podcasts to embrace and how to build an audience. But nonetheless, still, that podcast, although the reach was much smaller for Vice President Harris, she still was closing in on a million listeners, and most of them skewing younger. The vice president's podcast or stream appearances also included Club Shay Shay with Shannon Sharp and All the Smoke with Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson, with an estimated total reach of at most a quarter of the viewers her opponent reached by Election Day. If a new record amount of money is to be spent in 4 years for the next election, it is difficult to see how legacy media can once again grab the overwhelming amount of advertising dollars after this election day. Media outlets charge advertisers rates based on audience size and favorable target demographics, both of which are dwindling for television. Now, after several more years of audience attrition through continued outmigration to newer media channels such as social media and podcasts, as well as cord cutting, these rates will have to come down to justify the spend, and more money will flow toward the rising media channels of podcasts, social medias, and apps. Election night viewing results were really eyebrow raising. And this is why I say that I think we have experienced in the media industry the last election that is so dominated by old school, traditional, legacy media and their big brands. Just based on the numbers alone that Nielsen is providing, the change has occurred. And it's not a matter of when or if, it's here. And what I mean by that is when we dig into these numbers, you'll see that the media landscape, as we know, has been changing. But on election night, for such a historic, dramatic presidential election, we're going to see where the people were and where they were not. And on election night, Nielsen says that the 42.29 million viewers for 18 broadcast television and cable channels was a decline of 26% from 2020, when there were nearly 57 million people tuned in to traditional television and cable. And it was a decline, the 2024 television and cable audience was not only a 26% decline from 4 years ago, it was a 41% decline from 8 years ago. That's stunning. And if you just take that at face value, even, the fact is that Nielsen reported that the audience for cable news and for traditional broadcast television channels was closing in on 50% less in less than a decade. Nielsen furthermore reported that election night 2024 was the least watched election night on traditional television and cable since it began keeping total viewer records in the year 2000. But the bad news for television gets worse. Nielsen also reported that election night 24 had the smallest audience ever, dating back to when it started beginning to keep records, which was in 1960. So, once again, just to repeat that, election night 24 was the smallest audience on record for Nielsen as far as those tuning into television, regular television broadcast over the air stations, and cable. And of all of the households, of all of the TV households, of all of the households that are connected to television of any kind, and we know that basically 100% of American households have a TV, even if it's an old school an antenna and they're only getting over the air broadcast. It's basically 100% coverage today. Well, out of that, only 22.6% of all possible households watched election coverage using broadcast television or cable as a source. So when you realize that in election day 24, with despite all of the drama and all of the forecasting that this was going to be a very tight race, very close race that could take days and days to determine who won, television, and we're talking about 18 channels, television and cable couldn't even get a quarter of the total population to tune in. Now, those that did tune in to television for election night coverage went to the big brands. and the giant majority to just a select few outlets. So more than 38 million of the 42 million plus chose the big four broadcast networks: ABC, CBS, Fox, and NBC, and the three largest cable news outlets: CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC. But all seven of those channels had smaller audiences than in 2020. So let's break down the prime time numbers on election night. Out of those seven uh, channels, networks on either cable or over the air broadcast, on election night, Fox News had by far the largest viewership with just over 10 million viewers. MSNBC was second with about 6 million, and just behind MSNBC was ABC with 5.9 million viewers. NBC attracted 5.5 million viewers. CNN had 5.1 million. CBS was distant behind CNN with just 3.6 million. And the Fox broadcast network had around 2 million people. Cable news clearly took the biggest overall hit in audience levels. CNN had the largest drop with a stunning 46% decline in their audience from 2020, followed by Fox News, who had a decline of 27%, and MSNBC, who had a decline of 21%. On the broadcast side of things, CBS had the biggest drop with a decline of 20% of its audience from 2020, while ABC was down 6% and NBC down 5%. Fox broadcast was down a third from its election night results. The smallest television audience for an election night since 1960. Didn't mean, though, that Americans were not interested in the results. They just went somewhere else. And for many, that was YouTube. YouTube had 45 million viewers on election night, or about 3 million more people than 18 broadcast and cable channels combined. YouTube reported that Fox News was the most watched stream on its platform election night, followed by NBC News, and then Live Now, which is another Fox News channel, and then ABC News. Now, although YouTube had more consumers than the 18 broadcast and cable channels on election night, a majority were not necessarily tuning in for political coverage, which is itself an entirely different discussion to have. Millions of Americans were just not interested in watching election results on election night. And many went to YouTube for alternative programming, if you will. Although many did go to YouTube to watch um, political coverage on their tablets and their phones, the majority of people of that large audience on election night were not watching political content. Another trend worth noting is that the largest segment of viewers tuning into broadcast or cable news on election night were 55 years or older, according to Nielsen. So this is really not that much of a surprise. We have known for quite a while now that not only was traditional television as well as cable um, experiencing a smaller and smaller audience, but that those that were maintaining their viewerships using traditional television channels and cable were also getting older. So it's worth noting that um, the election night coverage on broadcast and cable was primarily viewed by those 55 years of age or older. That age group actually comprised nearly 60% of the total audience. And the next largest group of viewers tuning into traditional television and then cable were between the ages of 34 and 54. And they made up 28% of the total viewership. So the fact that 86% of the total audience utilizing traditional television and cable were 34 years or older is yet another stunning stat that helps form the opinion that television is going the way of broadcast radio and really on a path of no return to attracting the largest audiences any longer. It's clear that television skews older, and 86% of the total audience watching ABC, CBS, NBC, Fox, the CNN, MSNBC, and Fox news outlets on cable, 86% were no younger than 34. And long before election night 2024, we knew this on election night 2020. And even before that, we saw, and the industry has seen that the younger you go under 35, and as you get into the demographics of the 20 somethings, and then you get into college, television just falls off a cliff as far as utilization. It is primarily all mobile, it's tablet, and it is social media, and now podcasts. Well, the Nielsen numbers just reinforced this age gap now on who is using television and the brands and the content providers on television for not just political content, content in general. But on the other side, not only is social media, podcasting, and apps dramatically rising in popularity and recurring users on mostly mobile devices, but the demographics just skew much younger, especially in the most coveted demographic for advertisers, ages 18 to 34. Any fallout for legacy media, and particularly television, in political advertising as a result of this election may be seen as soon as the next midterm elections for Congress in 2 years, with a noticeable shift in advertising money and campaign strategy results in a pivot to social media and popular podcasts while television stations fight for a suddenly smaller stream of revenue. We will know soon enough if this will happen, if political campaigns will finally say we just simply can't put all of the money or most of the money into television. There's other channels, there's other sources of media that people are now using that we're going to have to spread the money out. Well, we're going to know soon enough as the next campaigns for the midterms are already starting in the never ending world of modern political marketing. Now, on the actual financial side of political campaigns, so much advertising money was spent for the 2024 US presidential election that post election data uh, analysts will need more time to sort and finalize the actual number of dollars that were used to influence voters this year. But one fact was clear long before Election Day. This year's presidential election was easily the costliest media spend ever, and it's not even close. As of November 18th, there's really no clear consensus to a final or approximate estimated dollar amount that was spent on campaign advertising. But 2020 election spending which is conservatively estimated to be $9 billion, although some organizations report that they believe as much as 15 billion was spent. Well, that 9 billion was easily surpassed by Labor Day. And right now it's estimated that at least $11 billion was spent, a total expected to rise in the weeks ahead as more final tallies from numerous campaigns, affiliated groups, media outlets, and ad agencies, among others, do come in. But it is in general expected that the final 2024 election advertising cost will be somewhere within the 11.5 billion to 16 billion dollar range, which is just, I mean, it's stunning that we could be reaching $16 billion in advertising for the 2024 election. The political watchdog organization Open Secrets reported nearly a month before Election Day that it expected spending to reach $18 billion adjusted for inflation. So we'll see where that number comes in, and it's worth noting too that when we're, regardless of what it is, whether it's 11.5 billion, 16 billion, or 18 billion, this includes advertising for all levels of campaign advertising. So what I mean by that is it's not just strictly for the presidential candidates. This includes political advertising for Senate races, for House of Congress races, for local elections, for governor elections, and so on. So this is the total amount of money spent. Although that being said, the overwhelming majority of these billions of dollars was allocated for the presidential candidates. Now, television, including broadcast, cable, and satellite, as I had mentioned earlier, took in the most money by far in what may be their last gasp of legacy media dominating campaign spending so easily. Social media and podcasting grew sharply in the amount of money that it took in from political advertising, but they were still significantly behind. Interestingly, though, and this is something that is very interesting to review and talk about. Overall internet traffic during the week of election day was down. Now, there's an organization called SimilarWeb, and SimilarWeb reported that web traffic from the day before election day through the following Saturday this year was down nearly 21% compared to the same week in 2020. Now, analytical data suggests that just as Americans steered from television, they also stopped visiting political content online via news sites and other sites covering the election the days before the vote and afterwards. This idea of election fatigue seems very real, and it was playing a role during the summer and in the weeks leading up to election day. There was real election fatigue, and similar web's data analysis that overall internet traffic in the United States was down 21% is interesting as well. And a lot of the top 50 news sites um, did not sustain the levels of visits that was expected. And again, for most of this campaign that just ended, we had been told, the general public had been told, that this was going to be a very tight race. Don't expect for it to be decided on election night. It could linger for days. Of course, there was all the drama coming out of both campaigns. And yeah, the media skeptic in me says that, of course, it was in the best interest of media to play this all up, to try to keep people tuned in, to keep them visiting the websites, keep them reading the papers, keep tuning into the commentary shows, and so on. But overall, the data is suggesting that election fatigue was very real, um, and that people did not necessarily continually tune in to different methods of media for information. Now, on election day itself, though, Similar Web reported that traffic to the top 50 news websites was up almost 7% compared to election day 2020. So on election day itself, the top 50 news websites did very well. Traffic was up across the board about 7%. But on election eve and on the days after the election, it just dropped. The interest wasn't there. And as I said, data analysts are suggesting that election fatigue was a primary role in this, as well as the fact that, unlike the forecasts, when most people woke up on Wednesday morning, after election day, the results were in, and it was more or less already presumed that President Trump was going to be once again elected. So there wasn't really much drama, uh, as was expected in the voting counts. Possibly the biggest winner, other than YouTube on election day, was X. And despite all of the negative reporting coming from a lot of uh, competing media outlets, and maybe a general belief that X is on the decline and it's hurting, the numbers don't support that. On election day, X had nearly 47 million visits for its best day of traffic in the last year. And X's election day performance was 38% better than its average visitor traffic in 2024. Another thing to think about is, in the weeks and months to come, the media industry, most especially legacy outlets, will have no choice but to take a blunt look at the business models they have in the aftermath of this election. The electorate, at least as far as those who voted, is essentially split at 50%. Now, is it good for business? And more directly, is it sustainably profitable for an outlet to be biased in its coverage and intentionally speak to only half of the potential total audience? Does that business model make sense for protecting and increasing the worth of the outlet as an asset for possible sale? And another thing to think about is, as the media industry continues to change, will those outlets that are in contraction try to meet in the middle and be less partisan and change their shows, their personalities, and their overall content? And will those experiencing growth stay the course and attempt to maximize growth within that group that it's targeting and not change its content, its bias, or style? Or will they attempt to grow larger by expanding its target audience? And how do aging media outlets on aging platforms, and I'm primarily talking about television, the ABC, the CBS, NBC, Fox, How do these aging media outlets on a dwindling platform such as television and cable in popularity and use, how do they continue on? Will digital finally become the primary media method in America? And how do legacy outlets find their place in that ecosystem? Cable television subscriptions are now down to just 55% of the total television audience. Cord cutting continues in major numbers. The major cable providers routinely report subscriber losses in triple digits over the last several years. And with the total cable audience now down to just 55% of the total audience, is a major existential shakeup about to occur, with many established channels about to sign off or become a side note and a minor brand as part of an ever growing umbrella of applications, mobile apps. And as I suggest this, just last night, NBC Universal reported that it's going to split its holdings. And it's very telling what NBC Universal is planning to do. They want to they want to separate CNBC, MSNBC, the Sci-Fi channel, and others. They want to separate that from the NBC television network, the Peacock app, and Bravo. And the official reasoning for this is that by NBC Universal separating CNBC and MSNBC, etc., that company, it will be like a new company, and those channels will fall under that company, that umbrella, and that company can focus on those brands, those stations, and grow within it. But the skeptics in the market and media analysts are saying this is a nice soft way of NBC Universal saying we don't see we don't see the future for MSNBC and CNBC and the Sci-Fi channel. There were a couple of other channels as well. We don't see the future as very bright for these stations. Which makes a lot of sense, because why would NBC Universal go through the trouble of separating select channels from its umbrella, its portfolio of stations? It's noted with media observers that it is holding on to Bravo and keeping Bravo within the NBC television network and Peacock app portfolio. Well, because Bravo is easily um, their best performing cable outlet in their portfolio. So it didn't even want to bother to put Bravo in with CNBC and MSNBC, um, presumably because it was gonna pull it down. So one has to think that NBC Universal believes that MSNBC and CNNBC and Sci-Fi, as they are right now, they're just not worth investing into and trying to build. They've reached their ceilings, and they could very well be, as part of this new company, this new spin-off, they could very well be acquisition targets for another media company. But it's just very interesting that in less than a month after election day, NBC Universal made this really large announcement of changing its business model and, in a way, divesting. from a bunch of channels that was part of its portfolio. So, that really drives home the feeling that we are staring at the eve of the most consequential crossroads in media history since the advent of cable in the late 70s, early 80s. And we know how cable changed media and content consumption. And it feels like we're at that precipice now with podcasting, mobile apps, and social media. And it does feel that television and cable are going the way of AM and FM radio and the printed magazine or newspaper. And but whatever happens, political campaign spending is definitely going to be an influencer to those decisions in the media industry across America in those executive offices. So we'll stay on top of it. We'll keep looking as more news comes out about what the media giants are planning to do. We will write about it and talk about it. And if you're interested and you didn't hear a podcast that I had recorded just before Election Day, go to the website GeneKingLive.com, and you will see on the website there the podcast app, and take some time and listen to the podcast that I had recorded about political advertising a couple of weeks before Election Day, because that really got into the data of which outlets were receiving the money, which states were receiving the money, how each political campaign was strategizing their advertising spend. And listen to that, and then with the knowledge of what happened on Election Day, it'll seem very intriguing on if the strategies paid off and really what it means for the media as we're talking about today. So let's wrap up this episode of Mediums, Messages, and More. I'm so happy that you tuned in. Be sure to go to GeneKingLive.com, where you're going to have access to all of the episodes of this podcast. You'll have access to a bunch of written content for our Mediums, Messages, and More Substack newsletter. There's YouTube videos on there as well. We also have some industry news that's located on the website. So a lot of content there at GeneKingLive.com, or just go to Substack.com and type in mediums, messages, and more, and you'll find a lot of the content as well that I'm talking about. So thanks again for tuning in. I hope to talk to you soon. We'll do another episode of the podcast very soon. And be sure to reply on GeneKingLive.com or on Substack to this podcast and the newsletter content, and I will get back to you. Have a great week, a great day, and be sure to tune in to our next episode coming at you soon. Be well.